You're the class too.
I'm in the class. All right, so this is our third class already on the Constitution, and so we've covered now the preamble, which sets up the foundation in Article 1, where we discussed the framing of the Constitution, and so today we're going to do Articles 2 and 3. So who was Article 2? All right, so the floor is yours.
Alright, so I was given why the president is important, and the president has a lot of different rules. He is pretty much, or he or she is the head of, the Constitution, and so I wrote down the 9 main rules he has as president, and I won't read through each one, but I'll just say what each one is. The first one, or I don't think they have like a certain order, but it is Chief of State, Chief Executive, Chief Administrator, Chief Diplomat, Commander-in-Chief, Chief of Party, Chief Citizen, and Chief Economist. And he isn't like on top of everything where he rules everything, but he kind of filters through like the things that Congress, like the legislator makes the laws, and then the president will go through and filter them and see if that is the right thing to do. And but the president also doesn't like control the people, is more of a good example, and making a good example for the people and stuff. And then but and also it's important to note that the president was like not just put in his place, but had the equal amount of votes from the United States. So it was more of a choice from all of the people instead of just the Constitution. So that was a pretty important thing. And let's see. I think the president is just important because it is put in a place to set rules of the United States so that we can make, like it said in the preamble, a more perfect union. And so that's the president plays an important role in that. I don't think I have much more. If anybody has like questions or anything.
Questions?
Is the president the only member of the executive branch?
So isn't the vice president as well?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is there more?
What question do you have?
How was the vice president voted on, and how is now the vice president voted on? Because there's a difference.
Like, how did it become the vice president?
Yeah, so from the articles, how was the vice president originally decided or determined?
I think it was voted in from each. There's like the states set out each people, like people 4 in the houses, and then each person takes a vote on which one, on the vice president, right?
Yeah, so that traditionally the president would have been voted upon, and whoever won would be president. Traditionally, the second vote would then go to the vice president, whereas nowadays we have parties that elect their nominees for the presidency, and then they choose who will follow along with them as far as vice president goes.
Yeah.
Really good job, very thorough.
Yeah.
So what was one thing you learned about the president that maybe you didn't know before?
A lot of the stuff with like, because I read a whole article on all the important rules it has, like the chief and stuff. So I learned a lot from that, like just the things it's in control of, and how it's not like completely in control of everything, and it's like all of the Constitution together working together. I thought that was pretty interesting.
Good. Any other thoughts or questions? Excellent job.
Yeah.
Thank you for taking the time. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
That was good. So we have Article 2, right, that's now shaping out. We went from the legislative branch to now the executive branch, which is part of 3 branches that are meant to be co-equals. And I think you pointed that out rightly, is that I think a lot of times we think in terms of the president being kind of the top of the heap and whatever the president says goes, and that's not how our government is designed at all. And there's a reason for that, because we came out of England, who had a monarchy, right? And so we're getting away from the idea of kingly lines and kingly succession, and having dynasties through lineage, which happened in England. So who was the first president? Do you remember that? Yeah?
George Washington.
Yeah, George Washington. And in fact, one of the interesting things early on when they started to try to demonstrate what they were going to call this person, president wasn't the first one. I mean, they went through things like His Excellency and stuff like that. And John Adams, who actually was the first vice president, actually wanted to put that office at a much higher position. But kind of the fight or the tension against that was, we do not want to elevate somebody to a position much like the kings or the queens of old. We want to have a different form of government. Remember that we're trying to have a representation government, right? And so we're not a true democracy. We're a constitutional, remember what that was last week? Republic. And it's really important that we understand the distinction there. Democracy is based sheerly on whoever has the most votes rules. What this kind of alludes to now is and it talked about the Electoral College a little bit, is how do we elect presidents, and why this is a better way. And so before we move on to the judiciary, I want to take a little bit of time to kind of discuss the presidency as a whole, and then reflect on some of the stuff historically, some different presidents, and maybe have some conversation around that. So just really quickly, I want you guys to think of who historically is your favorite president, and why.
Probably Abraham Lincoln for me.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing too.
And why Abraham Lincoln?
Well, he just followed a really seemingly disciplined way of life. He's probably the president I know most about.
Mm-hmm.
I did a book study on him, and we actually talked about him a good amount in me, Noah, and Manuel's
Mm-hmm.
times together. He was using a lot of examples of some things that we talked about a right way to rule and state of mind while you're ruling.
Mm-hmm.
And I just like a lot of the decisions he made and things that he did. But yeah, that's probably my favorite.
Okay. You said as well, Kayla, Abraham Lincoln. So why for you?
Well, I feel like it's pretty much the same thing with the way he decided to lead. And it's just, well, a lot of the first presidents back in the day you could see how they actually did a good job of leading their people, not as to nowadays. They don't do that. The last couple of presidents haven't done a very great job, I feel like. But I feel like he did just a good job leading and, like, took care of the United States.
I don't want to repeat anything, but I would probably have to say the same thing because I did a study on Abraham Lincoln, and we were just reading a book about his life and stuff, and just about how he began to learn about things, and just his example seemed very good for people in the way, like Kayla and Elijah said, how he leads and stuff. So I think it was a very good example of a president.
I haven't really gone through many presidents' histories. The president I know most about is George Washington.
Uh-huh.
I just think it was he had a good example because he didn't. Well, I mean, I guess that was part of ruling president, but he wasn't trying to rule. Like he didn't want to have control over anything like a king does.
Yeah.
And I think that was, and also he was the first president, so it's pretty cool.
Good. Way to be original. I'm just kidding. I expected those answers. No, do you want to
Yeah,
share?
I have to agree. Although Obama's really my favorite.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. I do really like George Washington and Abraham Lincoln for sure. I wish I knew a little bit more about other presidents. I just have really. You know what? Actually, I wish I knew more about this president too, because he's really popular and favored. But Teddy Roosevelt is also probably among my favorites. And again, I probably know more about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln than I do Teddy Roosevelt, but he seemed to be a really interesting guy. I probably like him mostly for his personality and the way that he did things in his own individual life, which I've heard more about than his actions as a president, believe it or not. But one thing I like a lot about Abraham Lincoln specifically, who I think is probably my favorite out of the three, was his the way that he really adhered to the classical Republican idea of leadership and involvement in government, and his just the way that he, I think, very effectively served as someone who knew that he represented his country and his people, especially in the tumultuous time that he served in, which of course was during the Civil War. And obviously he was instrumental in some of the major things like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and those things being passed, and how impactful that was on American society, and obviously his involvement in making sure America remained unified rather than split in two, as was close to happening, or I guess did happen for a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
But yeah, I really like. Elijah had mentioned that we did sometimes discuss certain aspects of Abraham Lincoln's character that are admirable in some ways, and that I do really appreciate from him as well. But yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So what you guys described was Mount Rushmore. Three of the four presidents represented we talked about. I would agree. My favorite.
Thomas Jefferson's cool too.
Yeah, he's pretty good too. He's pretty significant.
Yeah.
My favorite president is Teddy Roosevelt, but it's only because we share a birthday.
Oh,
So actually, I'm one of the things that I'm really passionate about is American history, presidential history in particular. And so actually, just before when Kellen was born, I began to read a biography of every president going through. And so when we look at presidential history, what is really fascinating is that as we describe these presidents, we're really describing people that had to overcome a specific challenge, or there was something unique in the time or the season that they were in. Without the Civil War, we may not know much about Abraham Lincoln, really, that we do today. I mean, the Civil War was a pretty major point in history, right? Culturally speaking, our country was dividing, and yet it was his consistency, it was his demeanor. I mean, because he had a tendency to be a very firm and outspoken, but could also be very reserved and laid back. But his ideals around the idea of government and how a president should lead was really significant in keeping that whole ideal that we talked about, that more perfect union. In fact, I'm going to read his Gettysburg Address because it's his most famous speech, and really kind of helped redefine America after the Battle of Gettysburg, which I'm sure you guys are vaguely familiar with, right? Gettysburg, the war between the North and the South. Gettysburg was the turning point in the Civil War. It was a battle that was fought in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, just outside of a little Bible college, in fact, on a hill, and the North was defending. Robert Lee decided to charge. We have Pickett's Charge, where the South ran over a mile over open area, were bombarded. We see things like on Little Round Top, where there was defensive posts at the very edge of the line, where they created like a fish hook to protect themselves. The South had sheer numbers, should have won. They had better generals, and yet the North stood firm. And so Abraham Lincoln writes this really quick speech on a train trip from Washington, D.C. to Gettysburg, and then says this. And I think it does a good job of, again, giving us a picture of the ideal that we have for a president. Abraham Lincoln wasn't perfect. There's no such thing as perfect humans, presidents that lead, but this certainly demonstrated for us as a country the ability to heal and overcome and recognize the cost that it takes to defend the Constitution. It may sound vaguely familiar to some of you. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that this nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. And so, Lincoln is rightly considered one of the greatest presidents that we have.
I used to have the whole thing memorized.
Yeah, I did too a long time
Too bad
ago.
you didn't mention this just a few months ago. You know,
Then you'd have had it.
Yeah.
But do you see the seeds again in there of going back to this idea of what we were consecrated for, what we were set upon, this whole ideal of liberty, and what happened historically between the Constitution and then the Civil War is kind of this eroding of the presidency, the eroding of kind of the offices of power, the separations of power. And we see this in modern times. More recently, I don't know if you guys pay much attention to our recent presidents, but there's kind of a different ideal that is presented now. We have kind of going from, remember, the Articles of Confederation, which had a weak central government, and so we came with a constitution to kind of beef up and give some strength to the idea of a central government. Well, we've now kind of at the tipping point historically where we look at modern presidency, where the presidents are getting more and more power. So the executive branch all of a sudden is becoming what it wasn't designed to be, which is in power and sitting atop of everything. And so this is a balance now that we have to strike of saying, there's a reason why we have three equal branches of government, and that as the legislature passes laws, the president has the power to veto, right, and override and make some decisions. But then they also have the power to veto the veto through a majority vote. And so we want to get back to understanding this ideal of the presidency, because I think one thing that has certainly been lost in our presidency, or with our presidents, is the way that we respect the office of the president. Now, I would hazard to guess that there are some people who are not favorable of certain presidents. So let's talk about that real quick. Historically speaking, and I want you to back this up. Who would you say, we talked about your favorite president or one that you think is like at the top, who would you consider, no, I don't think they were a great president, and why? So we've got to have this discussion. Because again, if we're thinking of this in terms of culturally, why is it important to discuss? Because what we're hoping to do here is get beyond personalities, right? Just because I tend to believe in these things, I will only like those people, or I disagree with that, so I dislike those people. We want to have an honest assessment of presidents. Because quite honestly, I was sharing this with Kayla this morning, the way that we tend to vote currently is based upon party line, and most people don't have a basic understanding of why they're voting for that person, other than they have a D in front of their name or an R in front of their name. They don't have really an understanding of what that person stands for, what they represent, the character of the person. And if you watched the news or kept up with our presidents, in the last probably 3 or 4 administrations, we see a lot of people degrading the president, regardless of what party they're in. There's kind of a shift, public shift, in the way that we treat and respect the office of the presidency. So, thoughts on who you is your least favorite president, or one that you think did not do a very good job?
Well, I've been doing research on asking people what they think our president now has done that is good for our community or our country, and what's something they can improve on. And most of the people I've asked have said nothing really, and then there are a few people I've asked that has said certain things that I want to make sure I back up on that, because I don't want to be all negative, because most of the things I hear about our president nowadays are very negative, and he hasn't done anything great, so I've been trying to find at least one thing that he has. Sadly, I haven't really found anything that's that great, but I feel like, no, he's not the worst president we have, because I feel like our first president have been, like, we've had good, and then it kind of escalated from there. So I don't really think that he's doing the best job, but I don't feel like any of our presidents the last couple of elections have been amazing.
Okay.
I don't really know much about presidents, but I'd say Bill Clinton was not a very good president.
Okay. So why?
Because he did some bad things, and like I don't really. That's the thing. I don't really know much about presidents in general, so that's
Sure.
probably the one. I have to agree with Kayla that the past few presidents haven't done the best job either. But I don't know too much about those things, so I'm not the best person to.
So you're reserving judgment.
Yeah, so I don't really know how to judge that. Besides things that I know that
So
have done.
do you see value in politics or presidencies, or would you say you're just like, whatever happens happens?
I don't think they're useless, no.
Okay.
I do see the value in learning all those things, and I want to. I just don't have
Sure.
a lot of knowledge about it. So
Yeah, good. That's an honest assessment. It's kind of why we're having this discussion, because we want to be, the goal here again would be to be aware, to think through, right, what you believe and what you think, and then more importantly than just what do I think or what do I feel, how do I back that up? Because again, we live in a culture that is very good at shouting opinions across one another. But again, as we talked about last week, right, there was a lot of really strong voices when it came to forming the Constitution, really strong personalities, and they learned the value of compromise in a healthy way, which helped keep that structure, the framework of the House in order, so that we made it through the Civil War, and that, God willing, we can make it through kind of the modern war of popular social media and the presidency being more of a figurehead than it is actual real work. So, other thoughts?
I really don't know if I can think of a president that, because like I said, I don't really know any presidents, so I don't think I can think of one that I've seen or thought of
done a really bad job.
Yeah. It's a little bit more difficult because we don't have a Mount Rushmore for bad presidents.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like, let's make a monument to the 4 worst presidents in history. Right? It's a little bit trickier, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's reasons for that. I think we want to tend to elevate people who we hold in esteem. All right.
I feel like I can't think of anyone specific, but I feel like especially for the past few years, there have been things that have been like more selfish in things, even in the people and in the president. Even when it comes to like voting and stuff, like the president might seem like he's doing stuff for the people and saying things that he will do for them, but in a way it's selfish.
Mm-hmm.
And even if he was doing what they wanted, it could be selfish on their side too, and they're not working together
Yeah.
as a nation. So I do see a lot of selfishness coming out. But yeah, other than that, I don't have any specific
Yeah.
president that I probably should do some more study on.
Yeah, no
presidents.
no worries. Noah, you have some thoughts?
I think when it comes to like taking a critical perspective of a president, and I guess 2 aspects of their involvement in the presidency, which are both either their actions as a president or their personal character, that usually you either take like a socially accepted perspective, which means that this president is by most considered to have not been a great president, and this president is by most considered to have been a good president. So like this usually has to do with more historical presidents, like we were talking about Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. They are like almost universally considered to have been good presidents for the most part. But like more recent presidents like Donald Trump, Obama, or even our current president Joe Biden, is like you were mentioning earlier with adherence to party ideals, is really a split thing. So some people can be all for a president, others completely against. So I'd have to say that as a result of this, my method, I guess, of choosing a president that I don't think is great has more to do with like almost like an intuitive hunch. For the most part, I can't really lay judgment based off of fact
Sure.
or evidence as to why this president was no good. Or so in that sense, I have some intuitive feeling that someone like Andrew Jackson actually would maybe have not been like the best of the best, because again, I don't know too much about him or what he did during his presidency. I'd like to study that more, but I feel like he kind of changed. Every president does this in one way or another, but he kind of really changed and brought, I think, a lot more power to the executive office, and also like expanded, perhaps to too far of a degree, the democracy and the democratic ideals in America, both socially and in government. And I can't give examples for that. It's just, again, this is more of an intuitive thing. It's some knowledge I may have read before, but don't really have the specifics of it anymore.
Sure.
And through personal experience, I don't feel that someone like our current president has done a really good job either. And even looking at things like statistics, which may not really be the best place to look sometimes, but even the statistics, both regardless of party, has kind of seen a decline in appreciation for Joe Biden. And again, I think like Kayla had mentioned, there hasn't really been much that I could, through my assessment of Joe Biden's presidency, point out as particularly beneficial things.
Sure.
But that, again, that is all kind of tainted, unfortunately, by the media.
Yeah.
So, and someone like Donald Trump, for instance, I think there were actually some beneficial things that happened in terms of economic improvements and more practical things like that. But I would certainly not be an advocate for his personal character as a president, whilst others would probably argue fiercely against that.
Yeah.
So that's that's like a strong difference between someone like Abraham Lincoln, who I appreciate the personal character of far more. But again, that is once more very much tainted by what the media puts forth. But yeah.
It's tricky because what you kind of alluded to is the modern ideal that there's kind of a fourth branch of government now, which is media, which is the way that we interpret things through a lens of, again, information that's given to us. And again, why it's so valuable for us to have these discussions is that hopefully what you're equipped with is the ability to discern between right and the wrongs of the president. And what we're really talking about here, and I think you alluded to it here, is that what have defined our really great presidents is you can look at them and really get a sense that they were for people. They were for the country, they were for its advancement. What you tend to see, and I would agree, Andrew Jackson is certainly on that, probably on the Mount Rushmore of more difficult presidents, although there were some far worse technical. He really kind of got the ball rolling because it was really the first president where we see kind of him not hold himself to the manner in which some of the other presidents had. So you had, rightfully, Esther, you talked about George Washington being the reluctant president. He didn't want any part of it, really. He would have been just as happy being back in Virginia doing nothing. But he again, felt the call like he did to be a general to lead the nation. And so, yeah, we see throughout the history of the office of presidency some real challenges there. And so I want to give you guys an object lesson, and hopefully I have your permission to speak freely here, because I've make some observations of our group. And so to try to put this in a more practical application, because it's hard when you're talking about, you know, people who are long dead or people who are in Washington now that really you don't have a context with. So in our group, generationally speaking, for your generation, let's say that Noah is president. He is the forerunner. He is, for this group here, right? He's, I think, even been put in a position of authority in certain measure, right? By those who are the leaders among us. And so we look to Noah as an example of a type of, right? That he's not just some figurehead for the sake of being a figurehead, but there's an authority that he holds. Would we not agree to that? So let me ask the three of you in particular right now, what is one of the challenges with thinking that? Would you guys say that you're always respectful to Noah?
I think a little bit.
A little bit?
More, well, the issue would be that we're kind of used to him, and he's our sibling, so it's easy to kind of fall into that goofy
right.
Kinda, goodness.
And by the way, Noah didn't ask me to share this. Hey, if you could. But yeah, you're talking. And we've talked about this, right? There's the familiar spirit.
Yeah.
There is really, and I'm glad you brought that up, because he's your brother. There's a difficulty there, right? And I'm sure that Noah's not always perfect in the way he responds or acts, but there is a position that he's placed in amongst the group, right? Not just by the leaders in our midst, but ordained by the Lord. There's a position that he's in. And the way that we respect that. And that means, elders. That means you younger than him and having to look to him and trying to make some separations here. And the reason I wanted to use this is because, again, when it comes to the presidency, this is a really good example of what has happened in our country. There's a familiarity that we have with the office of the president. In particular, really recently, and social media is a big driver, where we, get I'm old, so, you tweet your tweets or your tickety talks. I think Facebook's like an old thing. We used to have MySpace back in the day. You were probably too young for that.
MySpace.
Yeah. But all of these things where now you have the ability to just type whatever you want and put it on there for the world to see. We have opinions, and what we tend to do is we minimize the office of the president when we disagree. Now, we want to have healthy disagreements, right? We want to be able to have a discussion about it. But again, I would say practically in our midst, a really good object lesson is why do we respect, or why should we respect Noah? Is it just because Noah's a good guy trying to do his best, or is there an authority that is placed there that again, the office of the president, and Washington saw this, is that there's an ordination that takes place. There is a mantle of leadership or responsibility. Why is Abraham Lincoln a phenomenal president? Because he took the oath of office. He took the consideration of the Constitution as being very serious and a solemn thing, right? And there was a great many people who disliked him vehemently. Obviously, right? One of those people put a bullet in his head. And so we see throughout history, right? There's kind of this ideal with the president that we're becoming much more familiar. Might I just encourage you, and this is kind of a side note, that there's an opportunity in our midst to practice the kind of honor and reverence and respect, to be a people, again, who are trying to create a more perfect union, right? Is that not what we're talking about even amongst our group? This idea of a foundation or being built up in the Lord, right? It means that we as people of God, as people of this community, and in a historical and a cultural and a constitutional sense, the people of this country, it is incumbent upon us to do what? Well, we treat everyone with respect. But certainly the people who are put into positions of power. The Bible even talks about how God appoints leadership. And if you really think about it, how do we then discern, right, between a president who are going, man, they're making some decisions and they're doing things that I can't tolerate, can't stomach. But how do we respect and honor? And so I would say it's just kind of an extra credit, bonus points. You know, this whole idea is reflective upon the way that we operate amongst one another. And so why do we look to Noah in your generation? Because God has ordained him. Why do we look towards Emmanuel and Tim and John as leadership, right? Because we're submitted to them as unto the Lord. Why is that beneficial for us as a people? Abraham Lincoln said it, because it is a government that is of the people, by the people, and for the people. When we become familiar with people who are in positions of authority or power, it undermines us as a people. Why is our country going through great convulsions and difficulty? Because we don't respect the executive branch. We don't respect the legislative branch. There's even people that are ready to toss out we'll get into this now, the judiciary, right? There's a level of familiarity because we treat people like brothers or just, it's just my brother. And so I'm not meaning that again. Please hear my heart in this. It's not a judgment. But I really wanted to have an opportunity to give something a little bit more tangible. Caleb, the way that you respect and honor Noah is extremely valuable. And I want to point out as well, it's not just for your sake. Because whether you guys believe it or not, there is even a little bit younger generation who is looking to who? All of you guys. And I think you guys see that from time to time, right? Like the younger ones are watching and observing, just like you guys are watching and observing us older people, right? And the way that we act, and the way that we respond, and the way that we revere people is valuable. Not simply because they're, people should be respected, but because there's a authority. In closing kind of this section, George Washington noted that. The reverence. And so what happened after 8 years, Esther? Do you know what happened after 8 years of Washington being president? What he decided?
Like, what do you mean, what he decided?
Yeah,
to
so,
do, or?
yeah, what to do. 8 years came up because, right, there's nothing in the article that said that a president could only serve 2 terms. Right? It was open-ended. He could have been president forever.
Yeah, well, he decided not to because he wanted to go live on his farm.
He wanted to live on,
Virginia.
yeah. He decided not to because he wanted to live on his farm in Virginia, and because his inclination was to go against the idea of there being a monarchy where now all of a sudden there's this indefinite amount of time where somebody was in leadership. And there was a real fear that could take place. When we look at that through the lens of history, it's a good thing that it's not just passed down sheerly based on lineage, because what Washington did is he gave us this ideal of limited power. And so he had the popularity to do it. Now, we move forward in history to FDR, who ran for four terms, was really well beloved president, and could have went on even further maybe, but he died. And after that they said, well, you know what, we should probably limit. Let's go back to the George Washington school of thought, that 8 years is probably a really good ideal to not have somebody, who's, can you imagine? Imagine your idea of the best president being in there for 25 years. You probably go, yeah, that would be Abraham Lincoln, 25 plus years, if he would have lived, that would have been great. But think of the worst president. Imagine them for 25 years. And so limited government is really important. So Esther, thank you for leading. I think you did an excellent job. Let's transition now to the Judicial Branch, which is what article?
3.
Article 3.
Yes. All right. So there is. Let's see where can I start. So the Judicial Branch is very important because it is in the making and creating of, or deciding of the laws, and deciding really the meaning of them and the importance in laws and what they are doing within the people and the nation. And one thing that I found very important with this is that it really brings together everything, and that they are applying it to these laws to real situations in life. And so it's not even just a making of the laws, it's when they are made, it is applying to real situations. So one main thing that they do, or the Judicial Branch does, is determine whether laws are broken, or if they're being played out correctly. And let's see, there's one very important part. It plays a very important role in interpreting the laws in the Constitution. But yeah, it really does. The Judicial Branch shapes the public policy, and I think we need someone there to interpret the laws for the people and understand why they're really being used. So, yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, the interpretation of law is extremely valuable.
Yeah.
Because again, our tendency, or we're prone to do what? We're prone in human nature to go back to absolute authority.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have many more judges who are now interpreting whether things are constitutional or not. Good job. So what is one thing that you learned about the Judicial Branch that maybe you didn't know?
Well, I didn't really know too much about it already, so I did learn a lot about it, and just kind of the role it plays within the Constitution and with the people together. So I think it really is an important part of working together and stuff. So.
Yeah, referees, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have two opposing people that interpret things two radically different ways, or we have a set of rules or a set of laws that are passed. To not have somebody who is there to interpret those laws could be a really dangerous thing. And so again, we have now the legislative branch, which is discussing laws, passing laws, and it's not as simple as that, right? Because we have two different distinct entities within the legislatures, right? We have the House of Representatives, which is based upon population. It has as many representatives as they are based on that certain population, 30,000 or whatever it used to be the formula. And then we have the Senate, which is equally represented. Each state has two senators. And so they kind of hash out what they believe to be the laws. And again, we have the House of Representatives, which was like that mad dog on a short leash, right? That brings all of the passion and all of the ideas and turns over a little bit more and is really beholden to the people that elect them. And then we have the Senate, which we liken to a really wise, mature, they're in office a little longer, they have to be a little bit older to attain that office. And so that whole branch comes up with laws. We have the executive branch, which is not just a figurehead. It's not just somebody who looks up there and says, well, there's a president. But there's something about this idea of authority in the office that we are submitted to and holding that in esteem. But their job is really to execute, to make sure that the laws are actually, taking place. And so they have the force of the presidency to kind of empower, to make sure that those laws are actually being followed. And so we see that they have even the ability to veto and to strike down things that they say, well, no, that doesn't really fit within the ideals of what our nation should stand for. But then we also have now the judiciary, which is kind of the representation of kind of the referee or kind of the rule keepers, and saying, okay, well, let's make sure that everyone is playing on a fair field. And what we see historically throughout the Supreme Court is that there were some really poorly decided things that tended to go a little bit too far to people's ideals of the time. There's some challenges throughout U.S. history where we look back and reflect upon some really poorly decided things that we make some cases for. In fact, we're currently going through, number one, a nomination for a new Supreme Court justice by President Biden. It will be his first. But also that is there's kind of now reviews against what many people who are be on the conservative or the more evangelical side of things would say is really a poorly decided case, which was Roe versus Wade, which is the fight for abortion rights and things like that, that's being revisited. And so the Supreme Court is really important from that respect. Yeah, and in fact, there was a pretty landmark case almost not too far after the framing of the Constitution called Madison versus Marbury. And the importance of that was that it gave the Supreme Court the ability, they gave themselves basically the ability to have what's called judicial review. And so it used to be that the Supreme Court would kind of, if there was a argument between states or things like that, or there was some litigation one person to another, it would come up to that point and they were able to say, we'll look at the appeals process and we can review whether the appeals in lower courts was appropriately handled or not. What judicial review kind of changed is it made the Supreme Court the official, that was the last stop for things, and they could actually review laws that were put into practice. And so if a law is signed into today by the president, it could actually be immediately looked at upon review by the Supreme Court to see whether it's actually in fact constitutional. And again, why is that important? Because now we have a more robust system where all three representative branches don't have any more power than the other. So the Supreme Court is really tricky because, as you probably read, there's not a lot in there, is there? I mean, it's pretty basic. You get a few things and then all of a sudden you talk about jury trial, which was really critical, right? That if we're talking about, somebody murdering somebody else, we don't want one judge making that determination. Why? Why would you not want one person to decide?
Taking other people's opinions on what happened and stuff.
In the multitude of counsel, there is safety. Yeah, what if that one judge had a bias? They would be much more likely to just execute that person. Whereas you have a jury of your peers in an ideal sense. Now, juries aren't perfect either because juries can be cultures in and of themselves that control, right? If they have many biases against that person, that can create problems. But generally speaking, if we're following things well, a jury will stay within the confines of understanding the rule of law and how it's applied and then judge rightly. And then we also see in Article 3 that it talks about treason. What's defined treason? But our Supreme Court and the powers that are vested within the judicial branch starts out very limited, and there's a reason for that. There's a reason why Supreme Court justices are appointed for life, because again, they're not going to be swayed by popular opinion of the moment, right? We don't have a bunch of justices and laws are changing all the times to fit whatever the popular narrative is of that time. The dangers can be you get certain ideals that get a vote in that particular justice, and it could be a really negative thing, right? If you had multiple justices step out, or some of them were deceased all of a sudden, it can shift pretty radically. And so there's some really big challenges to the way that the judiciary was set out. And luckily, unfortunately, the way that it was framed, again, there was kind of some consistent thought. And so now we have 9 Supreme Court justices. There's arguments right now, I don't know how aware you are, but President Trump was in office, he got to nominate 3. And there was a really big issue when we were going up for the vote between him and Hillary Clinton. There was actually Antonin Scalia had passed away, and President Obama had nominated Merrick Garland, who is currently our Attorney General. But the conservatives on that side said, no, we're not going to approve anyone. We're going to wait until the people vote for this next presidential election. We don't think that they should be allowed to nominate somebody when it's such an important level. Well, Trump wins. Trump nominates Neil Gorsuch. He's a conservative voice. Then we had another Kennedy, who was a justice, step out. Brett Kavanaugh was put into place now, so that's the second. And then we had Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who passed away. Pretty big, iconic, more liberal thinking justice, who was on there. But interestingly enough, Scalia, who was very conservative, and Ginsburg, who was very liberal, were very good partners in compromise and in debate and discuss. But now what happens is there's a shift for the first time in years and years where Trump is allowed to nominate another justice, Amy Coney Barrett, who is more conservative. And so what we see was that the Supreme Court went from being liberal-leaning to now a majority, 6-3, who is now conservative. More recently, Justice Breyer, who's one of the liberal-leaning justices, had a lot of pressure to say, hey, you need to retire now because we want to make sure that we get it with a liberal president in here, that we get somebody younger. And President Biden actually came out and said what he was going to do was he was going to nominate an African-American woman, and that's all he was looking at to be a Supreme Court justice. And so he just nominated this particular lady, I don't remember her name, this last week. And so now we have kind of a younger, newer voice. And so what we're seeing currently is kind of this establishment of more younger voices. So 4 now out of the 9 were nominated within the last 4 years. And again, if they're going to live out their whole lives theoretically in that position, we've really shifted pretty dramatically the way that we think and the way that we interpret laws in the land. And so the Supreme Court is extremely valuable, but it's insulated from a direct democracy, right? You and I don't get a vote for who becomes a Supreme Court justice. And that's important because people who need to be impartial need to be separated. And so we see that the way that our government is designed is representative government, the legislature, right? And then we have the polar opposite of that in the judiciary, where the judiciary is insulated from the direct vote of the people. And who controls that? That's that executive branch. It's and how the executive is voted into office is really critical. That's the Electoral College, and we'll end on this here. And so the Electoral College, the reason that it works the way it does is, again, we are not a sheer democracy, we are a constitutional republic. Thank you. Yes. And this is why. So we have all of the ideas of the states, right? They have electors, so they have the House of Representatives and they have the Senate. And so what we do is we take the numbers from that, and each state gets assigned a number of electors. Now, traditionally, what these electors would do would be, let's say that their state voted for a certain person. Those electors would then go and cast their vote for a president. So again, theoretically speaking, the electors are the ones who determine who the president is, not even the vote of the people. The electors, though, represent the people. And so the minimum that we have now, so like the state that I grew up in, Montana, only has 3 electors. That's the lowest amount you can have, is at least 3. And so what the president has to do is he has to get a majority of the electors to vote for him. And so why is this significant? So currently we see states like, well, Washington's one of them, California, New York, that are almost automatically, even before we go to vote, will be on the Democratic side because they tend to be really heavily weighted. Now Texas, traditionally speaking, was almost guaranteed it's going to be a Republican state. And so the reason they put that in and the significance for it is this. The one primary reason why the state of Washington votes Democrat is the city of Seattle. Predominantly city regions tend to vote currently on a more liberal side. Georgia just went from being generally a Republican state to a Democratic state. Why? Because of the city of Atlanta. And so this is really significant to you and I, because if it were not for the Electoral College, the way that presidents would be voted would always be by the power of the city and not by rural places. But you guys live, I mean, you live in the big city of Joyce. We live in, the big city of Forks. The way of life in Joyce is vastly different, is it not, from downtown Seattle? And so this is important again, because if it's a representative form of government, we want our president that's voted on, not sheerly by the majority of people who think alike, but we want the president to be elected by a broad range of ideals. This then brings health to the Supreme Court, because as presidents don't tend to be, just one party all the time, and that it was really never designed to be a party system per se, but the idea would be that there would be enough change and consistency that the government is always pushing towards this idea of a more perfect union. Why? Because there's a lot of thoughts, a lot of debate, a lot of discussion, a lot of argument, but it was always geared towards unity. And if these 3 branches could work together equally and rightly, we would have a balance. In fact, we see in a lot of ways this triune idea of government borrowed from Father, Son, Spirit, right? Kind of the will of something, right? The order, the legislative branch comes. There's kind of the representation to make sure that it happens, found in the executive office, and there's kind of the intermediary that kind of makes sure that everything plays out the way that it should. Now we live in and I apologize, might go a few minutes here. We live currently in a culture that, as we talked about, has undermined the executive branch. The culture has, but what has happened within the executive branch? Our last 4 or 5 presidents have grabbed up more power and more power. We see that presidents, when they come in office, sign executive orders that just, nope, we're making this a thing now, and it has to go right to the Supreme Court. And so now the executive branch is becoming very powerful in a sense that, and it's not power that's given to them by the people necessarily, because it changes president to president. We see now a lot of infighting and polarization in the legislature, which is not super conducive, right? If you actually watch some of that stuff, you just see 2 sides yelling at each other, and no one cares. Like what one side believes when their group is in power is one thing, and then when they don't have the power, they're against that very thing they were for. And then we see now, more currently, what we have to kind of guard against is when we have political power taking shape, what happens with the judicial nominations is presidents kind of put in their polarizing figures that will vote for the way that they want to vote, instead of putting in justices who are going to be moderate or more balanced in their approach to law. And so our country, your generation, is faced with a great many challenges. because America is not living out its ideal. I think we can all be honest that right now we live in a pretty difficult season historically from a political standpoint. And again, kind of wrapping some of this stuff up, a big part of it is the way that we hold in esteem and respect the offices that are there. The way that we either disengage with politics altogether and just say, you know what, I don't understand it, I don't like it, I'm just going to avoid it. Or the way that we do engage, making sure that when we engage with a voice that is informed by, not just by what we feel is important, but if presidents only did what they feel, if legislatures only did what they feel, we'd kind of end up with what we have now, right? And I think we indicated that. The last two presidents we have, it's pretty challenging because there are some less than desirable traits that if maybe they looked to be an example to the people in humility, balancing both sides out, our country would do far better. And so we do have recently a president whose temperament left a lot to be desired, but whose some policies have brought some stability, and another president whose temperament is presented as something a little bit more desirable, but their policies aren't really helping us out. And so which do you take? You know, it's not ideal. And it comes back to you as a people, us as a people defining how culture should look. The cultural ideal is shaped by adherence to a proper set of principles. America is a great nation only in its ability for its people to be a government of the people, by the people, for the people. How we respond in that representation government is really critical, which means we practice things like respect and honor to people who are in a position of authority. That for us, amongst our people, right, it's not just serving God, but it's being obedient and submissive to the leaders that God has placed in our lives. They have a difficult task. And so, practically speaking, how do we live out this idea of the Constitution? Well, we're doing it. The whole way of life that we're living here is radically different than most people. Would you not agree with that? And there's things that are discussed from leadership that cause us to grow and stretch and be challenged in all of the best ways. And the goal always is what? A more perfect union. That requires Elijah as much as it does Emmanuel. Right? Each one of you. It requires me to do everything that I can do. Kayla, Esther, Naomi, Noah, all of us. So we started a few weeks ago by saying this: those who forget their history are condemned to repeat it. My continued hope for us is that we reflect upon this stuff, not merely as an exercise in what can we understand about Constitution. That's important. But the Constitution and the values of America point us to a much bigger picture here, which is how do we apply the kind of morals and values and right way of living that leads towards unity in the midst of a culture around us that is pressed up against us and stretching us. And so next week, Elijah, I'm going to have you lead us in Articles 4, 5, 6, and 7. So it sounds like a lot, but they're really short ones. In fact, Article 7 is basically people's names. And so I'm going to give you that task. But the other thing that I thought would be a good thing to do, and you can refrain from this, is for each of us to find an article on the new Supreme Court Justice nomination. And then I want you to reflect on like positives and negatives. So, you know, who is she? Where does she come from? Kind of how she thinks, so we can maybe have a discussion about her. And then did you have a debate point that you wanted to have for next week, Noah?
Help me to recall some of the things that you were thinking about there.
Well, we could do like we had mentioned, maybe Roe versus Wade, taking two different sides to that argument.
Oh, right. would we want to tie it in with the assignment you just gave everyone else as it concerns the research on the nominee, or you want it to be a completely different
Sure,
subject?
that's
Just
fine.
whatever you think.
Yeah, that works with me.
And just trying to include, obviously the time that they have to study and the time that we have during just
Perfect.
the 1 hour we have, so.
Yeah.
If we want to do it for that
Yeah.
specific point, everyone draws out the positives and negatives and stuff, and then we can have them debate over that
Debate.
issue, yeah.
So
Sounds good.
positives and negatives of Supreme.
Of the justice that's been nominated. Now, let me see if I can, I'm gonna have her name here real quick. Ketanji Brown Jackson is her name. And so we can talk about positives or negatives.
I see how to spell that, 'cause I
Yeah.
do not know this.
That's right there. Other than that, great job again this week, ladies. I appreciate you taking the time and the effort. Good job presenting.
Right here.
It's always encouraging hearing you guys share, so.
Sometimes it's hard to say stuff what you're thinking, even because I
Mhm.
feel like my thoughts are always really scattered. But
No, that's, I mean, and again, that's one of the hopes for this class is just being more comfortable in speaking and verbalizing
right.
and sharing. It's it's difficult, but it's an important part of shaping culture.
Right.
All right, I cut way into you guys' lunch.
No, you're good.
We have plenty of time. Our dad just dropped off our lunch, so we don't need to go.
Yeah, man, he didn't drop me off nothing. What's up with that?
We have
that's-
burritos.
we had forgotten something we were supposed to bring from the house, so.
That's all right, I was
Yeah.
thinking I'm gonna go grab some. Go grab something for that.
Thank you, Justin.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Where do you read about, like, what news sources do you use? Because for some reason I had not heard about the nominee at all. That's kind of different.
That was so she was within the last week.
Yeah.
I tried to read.
But it's probably because all the news is taken up with the issues in
Yeah,
Ukraine.
with Ukraine, yeah. Oh, that was another thing, and I'm going to talk to Emmanuel as well.
Sure.
But I'm thinking history moving forward. I thought it might be fun to maybe assign somebody each week a current event to talk about, and so
Interesting, yeah.
discussing current events and what they evaluating, constitutional law,
Yeah.
what's going on and what positives, negatives, and so having a multi.
What's the lunch plan? No plan?
I think they got lunch brought to them. I was gonna go grab something quick, so.
Continue to talk about the Constitution. Go ahead.
Oh, always.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking from that idea might be a good, because we'll wrap up the actual articles next week, and then following that up, we'll start getting
Right.
into, the amendments
Oh, that'll
and
be
things
good.
like that.
Yeah.
So we can have a lot more robust debates when we get to the amendments.
Okay.
Um,
Sounds good.
But I was trying to think practically, again, trying to get away from just the remembering facts for facts' sake, but getting more
Yeah.
into that critical thinking of how do what we're learning, how does it apply to the way that we're living or the culture that we're around, or, so maybe talking about some more current things like what we're talking about today, or
Cool.
Ukraine,
That sounds good.
so. We're just gonna make Esther start teaching every week.
You ran out of here.
Poor Elijah gets all the really dry stuff.
I have to make it look away.
I want to see some sizzle. I want your teaching to be crisp.
Alright.
You know
I like
what I mean by crisp? That's the little lingo that I used back in the day. Crisp.
Oh yeah, I use that word too a lot actually. My cousin uses it.
Oh yeah? Crisp. Keep it crisp. The other thing was really popular is like if you're excited about something, you'd say juice. You'd be like juice.
Oh yeah. Or clean.
Clean, yeah. Clean. Like those sheets are clean. No. You want to go get something, Kaylee?
Sure.
Is there like a burger place really close? Is Firehouse? Is that
I think it's.
Yeah, Firehouse is actually pretty good.
I thought they were closed for a long time. Does anyone need anything? Want anything? Your dad brought you guys stuff.
Yeah,
Right?
he brought it.
Yeah.
You want to go or you want to stay?
I can
It's up to you, sweetie.
go.
don't have to hang out with your old man if you don't want.
Nothing else gonna be happening here.
I see what's
This
happening.